Hello.
Hi, Matt.
Thank you all for joining us this afternoon. And Angela, it is a pleasure to get to sit down with you. Around 15 years ago when we met, I was at the Star Tribune and you were about to make the transition probably from KSTP to WCCO as news anchor. And now we are both found our way from these for-profit media companies to public media.
We saw the light.
Indeed we did, apparently. So tell me a little bit, why did you make the switch from WCCO to now NPR News, where you are a host of a show?
You know, when I moved to Minnesota back in 1994, I was a young woman in my 20s. I was single, and over the 25 years I've lived here, I've gotten married, had kids, I bought a house, I've switched jobs a couple of times, and I was able to work in two extraordinary newsrooms and fulfill a lot of my own personal goals as a journalist. But as I got older and a little bit more reflective about life, I found myself wanting more for myself as a journalist in terms of what I am able to contribute to a community which has given a lot to me. And I wanted an opportunity to do work that I felt was more meaningful and more memorable. So I love television. I've wanted to be in TV since I was 12 years old, as I told you, since I was a little girl. But as a woman now in her 50s, what I really love is helping people become more informed. You've lived here in the early 2000s, and since you lived here, Minnesota has changed a lot.
Yeah.
So the theme of the talk show that I'm doing now at Minnesota Public Radio, which I'm so grateful to have the opportunity to do, an hour each weekday, is to talk about the many ways Minnesota is changing. So that was a great opportunity for me to have this time, an hour, compared to a television news report, which is typically maybe a minute and a half or 2 minutes if you're reporting. And then if you're a news anchor, you really don't have great editorial control over what's in that newscast. So I was very drawn to the idea of having an hour to slow things down and really dig a lot deeper than what you see in headlines and in newscasts. And one of the big ways Minnesota is changing is that it's becoming more diverse. Mm-hmm. And right now in Minnesota, 1 out of 5 people who live in Minnesota is a person of color.
Wow.
And I don't know that people realize that, because a lot of people still say, in fact, I have voicemails now that's like, Angela, why are you always talking about race? Like, this is a state that has a lot of white people. Just like, get used to it, right? But increasingly, we're becoming a lot more diverse. And in the metro area, even more so. So, Matt, back in 1970, I think it's like 2.7% of people living in Minnesota were people of color. Mm. Fast forward to today, that number's at 27%. In the 7-county metro area. So that's a 10-fold difference. And I think our news organizations, we have not kept pace with that increase in the number of people of color, and as well as, our fastest growing population would be people who are 65 and older. Mm. So people who are 65 and older, beginning in 2020, which is next year in a few months, that group of people will be a larger population than school-age kids between 5 and 17. So having a chance to have a talk show to look at issues that affect people who are aging and people learning to get along with those who are different than them, whether it's your coworker, whether it's your new neighbor, whether it's the kids that your children are playing with, having an opportunity to have conversations about how our state is changing, and you don't have to be afraid of it or uncomfortable with it. Listen to the voices of these people, and maybe you'll have a better understanding and, live your life in a little different way.
I mean, this was one of the things I think that was most striking for me, being in Minnesota and then from here going to D.C. There's this perception, we say this word heartland, and there's this perception that even 15 years ago was false of Minnesota as a place that was only or solely white. In fact, there was a lot of diversity in the Twin Cities and in the state more broadly. And I think this continues certainly to, in fact, from a national perspective, how the national media sees and covers the Twin Cities and Minnesota more broadly. I'm curious, from a local vantage point, do you think that local news organizations have done a better job of reflecting the true picture of the state?
We're getting better. We still could be a lot better. There are a lot of stories that just don't get told. And, when you talk about the national media, there are a number of occasions in the last year that national media has come in and scooped us on stories that we should have been doing, as in Worthington. The Washington Post just did a story about a school bus driver in Worthington. They came here to look at how this community is changing. They've had this influx of immigrants, and many of the families who've lived there for generations are not real happy about that. And, I saw that story. It was very compelling, and I'm like, I wish we had done that story, Yeah. And, the New York Times has come here and done stories as well. I think our news departments are trying, but we're still not getting there in terms of really spending the time trying to develop new sources and create these connections and, give our reporters time to develop relationships. So certainly I think in public radio, we are doing a better job of it than the local TV stations are doing. Part of that has to do with staffing. TV, their staffs are very small, but still there are story ideas that never make it to that morning staff meeting, because when you look at the people in the room who are pitching story ideas, who are making decisions in newscasts, you're not finding people of color. And, quite frankly, you're not going to develop those relationships, and these story ideas are just not even going to be on the radar. And I think we have an obligation. I feel like our news staff should reflect the communities that we're covering.
Yeah.
When in my last job, I was the only black woman in a whole building.
Wow.
Any department, you pick it, I was it. And I used to think about that when I walked into work every day. If you picked any other business along downtown Minneapolis, would you find that in any other business, regardless of what product they were selling? You wouldn't. And for a news organization to have so much power and influence, we need to do a better job of increasing the numbers of people of color. Diversity has all kinds of meanings. I used to pitch a lot of stories that dealt with greater Minnesota or rural communities, because that's another way that we are different. But I think we've been very slow to respond. I mean, I came in 1994. Now in 2019, I don't think the numbers are much better in newsrooms than they were when I was here in 94.
Wow.
I mean, I've seen people like you who are heavily recruited by news organizations who leave.
Yeah.
And we just haven't kept pace in trying to recruit and retain talented people of color.
Now, in addition to making a shift from for-profit media to public media, you also made the shift from television to audio. And to radio. How has that shifted your approach? How has the medium changed the stories that you can tell and the way that you can tell them?
Well, I mentioned the time. Having an hour is great, but also being in a studio with just the microphone. So it's a very intimate setting, both for the guests who I'm interviewing and for the listener. So what I loved about TV, what I still love about TV, is the visuals. I mean, you can't compete with visuals. Video in itself can tell a story. It's very powerful. But without often the time and the effort to put that video into context, you lose something. An example today, we did a show about retirement savings. How do you save money for retirement? And having an opportunity to have two financial experts in for an hour to explain the problem, why it's hard, why it's just hard to save money, period. But what we're seeing with people recognizing that they're not going to be able to retire at 65, and then most people have accepted the fact that they're going to work till they're 74 or older. But then having our listeners call in and share their stories about why they can't save money. And you can hear the pain and distress in their voices. So I think that's very powerful, having this very personal experience of listening to someone share their story, and in your mind trying to think about, kind of absorb that information. And again, having the time to really fully explore a topic and bring in multiple different points of view on a topic. My intent is never to change anybody's mind about how they feel about an issue or a topic, but I can bring in a voice that maybe you have not ever had an opportunity to, to listen to. Whether if one of the recurring themes on our show, we do a lot on health, mental health, as well as workplace issues. And so having an opportunity to sit with someone who's not just a PhD. You don't have to be an expert in. You don't have to have a PhD to be an expert in something. If you are living with schizophrenia, you're an expert in that. right? And so we try to pair people who are experiencing an issue along with someone who has studied it. And together, it's a very powerful thing, I think.
Yeah. In a moment, I'm going to turn to the audience for a question, but I'll take moderated prerogative to ask another first. So as a local news host and as a public radio host, you occupy a distinct and I would say increasingly rare position of trust among the public. Trust in the media, in journalists in general, nationally, has been steadily declining for decades. It reached a high water mark in the 70s, but it's been going down for a long time. One of the places where the public still does place trust in their journalists is in local news. As a local news anchor, you are among the most trusted voices in the news ecosystem more broadly. How do you build that trust? How do you maintain it?
I think by being here and living here, and as a journalist, we work long hours, but making an effort to really immerse yourself in your community by doing volunteer work, by going to events when people ask you to speak at events, by asking your friends and your neighbors, asking them for story ideas, asking them what they're interested in, by being visible. And on the air, when I interview people and I ask questions, I put myself in the frame of mind of the listeners. Like, what would the listener want to know? And I try to reveal and show to people, like, I'm like you, right? I'm trying to figure out how to save enough money for retirement. And by disclosing that you have the same curiosity about things that they do, and being willing to show yourself and share yourself in your reporting as you're interviewing people, and letting people know that you don't think that you're smarter or better than them. You're like them. We all share this cold space we call Minnesota, but we're all experiencing it different ways. So I think the way I do it is through volunteer work and just by being here and by staying and by choosing to stay and be here and go through some of the many life changes that people who live here for a long time have also gone through.
Yeah. Now I have two rules. No manifestos. Ask an actual interrogative question as I turn to the mic. Over there in the back.
Hi, I'm Kim Hansen with the Bloomington Chamber of Commerce.
Hi.
And I listened to your program today. It was great.
Thank you.
How is the atmosphere at work different because you are listener funded and grant funded as opposed to at a television station where it's advertising revenue? How is it different for you guys as employees?
I think we feel a very distinct connection to our listeners because we know that we are publicly funded. I think half of our funding comes from our listeners through their donations. And I think the journalists who I work with, who are all very thoughtful and all very, take their jobs very seriously, always sort of have that listener in mind, and we view what we do as a partnership with the people in the community, and that we're public media, we're part of the public, and we're there to not try to please advertisers, not try to make one part of the community happier than the other, because that's the part of the community that helps us generate more revenue. I think we feel a very distinct connection with our listeners, and that we chose public media because we knew that existed and that there would be fewer barriers to just getting to the truth and being willing to explore, as many voices as necessary to get a story where it needs to be. Right.
Other questions? I think we have room. There's one over here in the front.
My name is Joel. I'm from Southwest Minneapolis, proud print subscriber and NPR member. I'm curious, on the flip of that, in the intro, it was mentioned how one of the things you fight is misinformation. How do you reach more diverse audiences throughout Minnesota? And how do you build that audience? How does NPR do that in this day and age like that?
Building more diverse audiences. Well, one of the things that NPR has done is we've created some very unique beats. We have a team of reporters I hope I get this right. I believe it's race, class, and communities. So we have a team of reporters. Thank you, my boss is yeah, who focus on trying to see and hear these very diverse communities, whether they're immigrant communities or people who are sort of outside of what people think of as being mainly our public radio listeners. And so a lot of time and resources are devoted to trying to bring people together and letting them know that we know that you're there, we see you, we're trying to establish relationships with you. Back in March, I believe, I hope I have the date right, we co-hosted a large conference on racial narratives and transformation on the campus of Hamline University, I believe with the Minnesota Humanities Center, is that right? And bringing the community together as well as community journalists and talking about, what are the stories that we need to have on our air and who are the leaders in these communities and what are your ideas about, what the broader community needs to know about how Minnesota is changing. So a lot of effort is put in both our, planning and teams and developing beats that allow people to develop relationships with immigrant communities and people who we just don't see in mainstream media a lot. Our reporters are a great source for me. I go to them a lot about, what are you working on? And, do you want to come on and talk about it more? Or give me some ideas of some people that you met that didn't make it into your story, but you could see would be a great source for me. And I think we have made it a priority to be inclusive and to tell the stories of the people who are also Minnesotans who we just haven't gotten to know yet. So many of our immigrant communities, if I look at the Hmong community, they've really become way more established now. Their experiences are much different than probably what they were in the 90s when I moved here. I did a show with, it was 3 of I believe now, we have 7 state lawmakers. So in our state Senate and our state, in the House, we have a whole caucus of Hmong legislators. And so these 3 of them came in and talked with us about their childhood experiences and having to grow up fast because they were the interpreters for their families.
Right, yeah.
And that moment, I'm like, I never thought I would see the day that they have their own caucus, and here I am doing a talk show with 3 Hmong legislators. So I think it's constantly on our radar. It's a priority, and I think we're making a lot of progress. And they are sharing ideas with us because they know that we will respond. And it's been a great asset to have them, contribute ideas to us because they know that we see them.
And in a few minutes, we'll be back to speak about misinformation specifically. So thank you for the question. And Angela, thank you for taking the time.
Thanks for coming back to Minnesota.
Yes.